Welcome to the Lynchburg City Church. My name is Joe Dexbrion, for those of you guys who are new. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you are new, I really encourage you guys, I know they didn't say this at the beginning of the service, but on your bulletins, has a couple things, including prayer requests. We want to be praying for you. And even maybe, as the sermon's going on, like you think of something, just a need. One of the things I always want prayer for, every week, is just prayer for my dad that Jesus will save him. And so if there's something that you want to put on here, Michael Moore does a great job, and he copies me in all these, and we pray for you, church. We pray for you. And if it's something of a really sensitive nature, you can always come and talk to me or Pastor Dane after the service, or email or Facebook message us if that is the case. That being said, I'm super glad you guys are here. I'd encourage all of you guys, after the service is over, to hang out. The early church did these things where they'd get together, they'd have a meal together. Those of you who've been here, you've heard me say this all the time. They called them love feast. Love feast. They'd get together and they'd have legit fellowship. And we're all about that here at the City Church. Authenticity is what I love and what we want to see, because church, we're family. We're a family, or at least we should be. You can go to enough churches where you just say, hey, I'm Joe, hey, I'm whatever your name is, and that's all you ever get to know about that person. But let's not be that way. So when the service is over, I encourage all of you guys, go out to Chipotle, to Wendy's, wherever you want, grab food, bring it back here, and then we hang out here and we eat, and this is crazy. We have conversations with people. Who knew? And then we play some really cool games. So I really encourage all of you to do that. As I said, my name is Joe. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm a Liberty grad. Most of you, if not all of you, probably have gone to Liberty at some point. I went to Liberty 05 to 09. And then I went to seminary from 09 to 12. I spent a year teaching high school Bible over at LCA. And I've been in the Army for about 5.5 years. I'm a captain, and I also serve as the battalion chaplain at the 497th CSSB. But tonight we're in the book of Obadiah. It is the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. 21 verses, 291 words, right after Amos. And this is our third week in Obadiah, and I'm anticipating that we'll probably finish up another 3 to 4 weeks. I never know for sure, but normally we can tackle about 3 verses a week. That being said, I want to give you a brief intro for some of you. This is just going to be a refresher, and maybe in a couple weeks one of you guys can give the intro. But the story, Obadiah, I date it sometime in the mid-6th century. Sometime after 586 and sometime before 553. It's written by a man named Obadiah. We don't know really anything about this guy except his name, which meant servant of Yahweh. But the story of Obadiah really begins back in Genesis chapter 25, when Abraham had a son. His son was Isaac, and Isaac had a son. In fact, there were 2 boys wrestling in their mother's womb, Jacob and Esau. It was this wrestling between these 2 brothers was almost this foreshadowing of what was to take place. This constant tension between not only them, but all of their descendants throughout history. Esau would go on to be the father of the nation of Edom, a small nation, no more than 70 miles north to west, 15 miles east to west, situated below the Dead Sea to the southeast border of Israel. Jacob would go on to be the father of the nation of Israel. And this is Israel right here. This is the Mediterranean. This is ocean out here. And Jacob would be the father of Israel. The 12 tribes, these 12 family members, these 12 brothers would represent the nation of Israel as a whole, until sometime after the reign of King Solomon, when the nation was divided into 2 pieces. The 10 northern tribes split, making up the northern kingdom of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes making up the southern kingdom of Judah. I reference Judah a lot in this sermon, and I want you to understand, yes, it is part of Israel, but after Solomon's reign, there was this divide. And because of the wickedness of the northern tribes, in 722, God brought the Assyrians in, and they conquered this northern kingdom. But Judah didn't have as many bad kings. They had some kings who feared God, and they still remained. We fast forward. The year is now 609 BC. There is a new and rising power in the region. coming from the banks of the Euphrates River, from what is modern-day Iraq. It is one of the mightiest nations ever be. Ruled by their king Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire was on the march. And they fought a major battle in 609 BC against the Egyptians, who at the time were allied to the nation of Judah. Their king, King Jehoiakim, that was the king at the time of Judah. And they're allied to the Egyptians, who in 609 BC fight a major battle against the Babylonians. The Egyptians lose. It's bad news for Judah. Nebuchadnezzar shows up in 605 BC. He shows up here in Judah and he says, okay, Jehoiakim, this is how it's going to go. I'm going to take whatever I want. I'm going to take whatever I want. I'm going to take whoever I want. And you're going to be okay with it. And there was absolutely nothing Jehoiakim could do whatsoever. Without their Egyptian allies, they were helpless. Now, before you start hating on the Babylonians, it's important that I make mention that the Babylonians were there as a result of the wickedness of Judah. It was God's will that brought the Babylonians to execute God's judgment on them. Jeremiah 27, 1-12 gives you a little snapshot of that. Jeremiah 27, 1-12. So this is the arrangement. This is how it's going to go. Judah is now allied with the Babylonians. It's 604 BC. It's 603, 602, 601. We'll stop the clock right there. In 601 BC, Judah's former allies, the Egyptians, win a major battle against the Babylonians. King Jehoiakim, who doesn't like this arrangement at all, decides this might be a good time to jump ship and be allied once again with the Egyptians, because they're getting a raw deal with the Babylonians. So they do this. And they understand that, yeah, the Babylonians might come again, but it seems as if the turn of power is returning back to its proper place. The Egyptians are now the most dominant. Well, Nebuchadnezzar comes back to Jerusalem, marches from the Euphrates and the Tigris River of Babylon back to Jerusalem. In 598 and 597 BC, they show up. The only problem is these Egyptians are nowhere to be found. And during the siege, King Jehoiakim dies. His 18-year-old son, King Jehoiakim, becomes king. Jerusalem falls. Nebuchadnezzar takes Jehoiakim, takes more people. The second exile now begins in 597 BC, and they take them all back to Babylon. And I should mention, for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, I think this is super interesting. You know, Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were all deported back in 605 BC. This is the same story, kind of interwoven together. So here it is, the second attack on Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He takes the new 18-year-old King Jehoiakim with him back into Babylon, and he sets up his uncle Zedekiah and makes him the vassal king. This puppet king, you might say. Well, this goes on for another couple years. It gets really old really fast. And sometime in 594, 593, Zedekiah, the vassal king, Jehoiakim's uncle, decides he's done with this, and he forms an international coalition to oppose Babylonian aggression. And one of the nations in that alliance was Edom, the house of Esau. Those two brothers back in Genesis 25 that were wrestling in their mother's womb, who were constantly friction between them and their descendants. Well, now the Edomites are on their side. Judah and Edom now have common interest. 586. Nebuchadnezzar comes back a third time. He means business. But right before he gets to Jerusalem, Edom switches sides. In fact, the prophet Ezekiel in the 35th chapter is just furious. He is just so sick over what Esau did. They stabbed Judah in the back. They handed them over to their enemies. In the first introduction I gave you and had you conjure up images of 9/11 and all those sick things that happened that day. And then how you'd also see in the news where people in many Islamic countries were celebrating in the streets That's Edom. Okay? These people are celebrating. Ezekiel tells us they're gloating over them. They betrayed Judah. They stabbed them in the back. And now here they are, this opportunistic people looking to get their share from the Babylonians. The city falls in 586. Zedekiah, the vassal king, is taken, put on his knees. His family's lined up in front of him. They execute them all. They rip out his eyes. They take him back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm done. Enough is enough. And he burns the city to the ground. He leaves only the poorest of the poor people in Judah. There is no national government. There is no military. There is no economy. It is poverty of a third world type. And more exiles are taken. Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm done. I'm not coming back here. It's over. And many of the people, they are disillusioned. Where is God? Doesn't seem like God is on the throne any longer. Seems like he's abdicated his throne. And as we saw last week when we explored Obadiah verses 2 to 4, we saw the pride, this external manifestation of Esau, the house of Esau, representing the internal sickness of their heart. Esau, so prideful, they think that they're untouchable. Verse 4 of last week, though you soar aloft like the eagle, though your nest is among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. Esau felt as if they could not be reached. And so, I placed the date of this writing sometime in the mid-6th century, sometime after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. That's very significant. And I give this historical background because all verses 2 to 21 is written in poetry. So I've had some of you come and be like, hey, I tried to read ahead and I had absolutely no idea what was going on. And I'm like, yeah, it's pretty thick. So this is what's taking place. Obadiah has been given a vision. He is being allowed to see things. He is being allowed to hear things that have not yet taken place. And as he begins to describe them more descriptively, we pick up our story today in verse 5. He says in verse 5, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed, would they not steal only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? Our English word if, this conditional word, is used 3 times in verse 5. I don't know if you saw that. It says, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, and then you skip down, if grape gatherers came to you. What Obadiah is trying to do here, and this conditional word that's being used, this if, is to express this question for Esau. To call the Edomites to reflect upon their own knowledge of what that might be like. What that might be like. What might it be like, Esau, if thieves came by night? Or plunderers came by night? Thieves came to you. Okay, what would that be like? Have any of you ever had your house broken into? Anyone in here? Anyone here? I'm going to step out of frame right now for all you people at home. Some of you guys have? Just out of curiosity, I don't want to put you on the spot. That's what's prior. What are the 2 things that they took when you broke into your house?
TV.
They took a TV?
And
Did they take everything?
not everything.
Okay. You served that. You said that you had your house broken into.
Yes.
Okay. 1 or 2 items that they took.
iPad.
Okay. Took his iPad.
Am I feeling insecure?
Did they take everything?
No.
Okay, they didn't take everything. Okay. When thieves come in, when plunderers come in, they don't take everything. They don't. They usually come in, they're going to grab whatever is most accessible, they're going to grab the most valuable things, and they're going to leave. Not going to take everything. In ancient Israel, it was actually against the law for those people who owned vineyards and other farms-like things. It was against the law when they were going and gathering their grapes, when grapes would drop on the ground, to take them. They had to leave the grapes on the ground for the economically marginalized, for the poor. It was almost a social program of sorts. So they're going through their vineyards, and branch falls on the ground, they got to leave it so that the poor people could come in and they could gather. It might sound very similar and remind you of the story of Boaz and his field. So that's what he's doing right here. He's posing this question. What would happen if thieves come in? What would happen if plunderers come in? What would happen if grape gatherers come? Well, the answer is they wouldn't take everything. And that is the point that Obadiah is trying to help us to see. That's the contrast that he wants. The purpose of these conditional questions is to contrast what would happen with what is going to happen to Esau and what they would experience. Esau is not going to be partially sacked. Esau is not going to be partially crushed or partially destroyed. No, they will experience the totality of God's judgment. There will be nothing left over. People come into your house, they steal things. Well, there will be nothing left of Esau. That's the point that Obadiah wants us to see here. But before Obadiah can even finish his thought and images, remember, Obadiah is having this vision. He is seeing things that have not yet taken place. He's hearing things that have not yet happened. There's this really awkward phrase right here. He says, how you have been destroyed. So he's writing this. If thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed. Okay, that's really awkward. It almost seems like it would make more sense if you read verse 5 and it says, if thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, skip that next phrase, would they not steal only enough for themselves? Well, that makes more sense to read it like that. But Obadiah inserts this phrase, this interjection. It's like almost like his own train of thought is interrupted here. And it reflects his disposition toward Esau's demise. But what is this disposition? Is this happiness that he has? Some people say, well, I think he's just happy. He's happy that these guys are getting their comings to him. And I don't think that's the answer. One, because as I was studying this passage, that word in the Hebrew that is used to reflect happiness over another's calamity isn't actually used here. No, this is what I think he's doing. When he says, how you have been destroyed, Esau, he is expressing the horror of what is going to take place. He is seeing things that haven't happened, and he is seeing this epic slaughter of men, women, and children. He is seeing gruesome images here in verse 5. Things that once you see, they haunt you forever. And I think he's also, what he's doing here is he is expressing regret. His regret and Yahweh's regret as well. I think that's what he's trying to do here when he has this interjection in the middle of the sentence. This is Jacob's brother, after all. This is Isaac's son, after all. We look on to verse 7. All your allies, Esau, all your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. You have no understanding. As I said last week, Esau thinks they've got it all together, right? I mean, they're writing checks they cannot cash. I mean, they're walking around thinking they're Channing Tatum, but in reality they're more like Jonah Hill. That's Esau. There is pride, there is arrogance. Esau is the type of the people that they have a contingency plan in place for everything. If you go there, they go here. If you come here, they go there. They've got it all figured out. They have their allies in place. They have their friends who they have a meal with. That's what he says here. And then all of a sudden, things that aren't supposed to go wrong begin going wrong. Their allies are now their enemies. And the very people that they sit down and have a meal with, And those are, you normally think of people that you sit down and have a meal with as people that are friendly, right? You don't think of people who are going to, they're laying a trap for Esau. If it could go wrong, it is all going wrong right now. And it ends up in the end of verse 7. He says one of the most important things in the entire sermon today. He says, you have no understanding. You have no understanding, Esau. In other words, Esau is so dumbfounded that they don't understand how all their contingency plans in place, their allies, their friends, how this is happening, how they're turning against them. They can't even begin to imagine the things happening to and around them. And Obadiah says, you have no understanding. So, it poses one of the most important questions in the text today. Why don't they have understanding? The implication is, if they had understanding, perhaps these things would not be happening. Perhaps there might be a way out. Most important question I found in this story. Why don't they have understanding? Now you might expect Obadiah to say, the reason you don't have understanding is because you're very prideful. We looked last week, we saw how prideful they are. Obadiah was very descriptive. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? In other words, no one will bring me down. So we might expect Obadiah to offer that as an explanation in 2 verse 7 to why they don't have understanding. But interestingly enough, that likely explanation is not what Obadiah gives to us. The answer is found in verse 8. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and understanding out of Mount Esau? This is what I did in my Bible. I know it's probably really hard to see. So I have no understanding right here, and I underlined that, and then I drew an arrow from no understanding at the bottom of verse 7 down to verses 8, where it says, wise men and understanding. Now, the answer that Obadiah gives to us here, Esau, you have no understanding. It's not as we said. It's not as we expect him to say, oh, because you're foolish, because you're dumb, because of your pride. No, he says, you have no understanding, and the reason why you don't is because Yahweh has removed it. Yahweh has taken your understanding. Yahweh has destroyed your understanding. Yahweh has removed any and all understanding that could possibly aid Esau now in their present crisis. He's done it. It's very reminiscent. It's very reminiscent of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. In fact, the commentary I was reading pointed back to the story of Pharaoh, where in order to achieve his intended result, he had hardened Pharaoh's heart. And in a very similar style and fashion, he removes the understanding. He removes the wise men. He removes the wisdom so that they cannot now have a solution to the possible crisis that they're dealing with, which leads many of us at this point in the story to say, I don't like that. And I know a lot of people don't. And so I'm going to try and explain this. These are very heavy and weighty things, okay? If you came here to hear a lot of jokes and laugh and stuff, you came to the wrong church, because that's not what I'm about. I'm here to give you some Bible, right? I'm here to spread a feast for you. We can go somewhere else if that's what you're looking for. We look at what happened with Pharaoh, okay? And I think many people see hardening of Pharaoh's heart, as I said, very similar to God removing all wisdom and understanding out of Esau, that it could possibly aid them in their crisis. But think about Pharaoh for a second. Moses comes, he says, Pharaoh, God says, let my people go. Pharaoh says, no, I'm not going to let them go. Scriptures say that God had hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now at this point, people think, well, that's not fair, right? It seems like a cruel father who tells the son not to spill his juice and then slaps his son over the back of the head, knocking him into the juice. And then the father's mad that the son spilt the juice, right? It seems like Moses is coming, he's saying, Pharaoh, let my people go, and God's pulling these puppet strings on Pharaoh so that he can't do what Moses is asking him to do, which leads really people at that point to say, I don't like that God, that's a cruel God. And I'm here to, I want to try and Because these are heavy things, okay? These are weighty things. If your brain's like, okay, it's really hurting right now, that's a really good thing, okay? If you're having to think really hard right now, it's good. This is what I see, and this is what I want you to see. It's not Yahweh being cruel to Pharaoh, no more than it is Yahweh being cruel to Esau. God is not a cruel God, He is a kind God. He is not pulling the puppet strings on Pharaoh as if a father smacking his child around, knocking his juice over, then yelling at the boy for spilling the juice. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is this. And before I say that, is the question we ask is not why would God do this, but how does God do this? The answer, why, is God does everything for our good and His glory. God does everything for our good and His glory. His glory, His glory. Why does God do that? For His glory. Okay? That's why. Okay? That's my drive-through McDonald's version to almost every single question you could possibly face. It doesn't always make sense, but there it is. Why that happened? God's glory, right? I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. I know, but He does. Not why does God do this, how does God do this? And I would answer this way. With patience, with kindness, with long-suffering, with forbearance. Think about it. How many plagues were there? There's 10. God didn't need to have 10 plagues. God could have wiped Pharaoh off the planet if He needed to. He didn't need to send Moses again and again. You know, it's sometimes like those, sometimes, I don't know if you ever experienced this, you're like really nice to somebody, and the nicer you are, the meaner and more angry they get. That's Pharaoh right here. Okay? It's like the nicer you are, the kinder you are. I'm praying for you, and they're like, rah, like whatever, okay? So how does He display this kindness? How does He display this patience? How does He display this long-suffering? He sends Moses. And Moses comes and says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no. God brings the plague. Pharaoh begs Moses to intervene. And the plague stops. And then Moses goes again. He says, Pharaoh, let God's people go. Let them go. And Pharaoh says, no way. And this goes back and forth, back and forth. Not why, but how. As I said, God could have wiped Pharaoh off like that. He didn't need to give him chance after chance after chance. And here he is, patience and patience and more kindness. And he sends Moses again and again and again. And Moses says, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no way! I'm not letting them go, Moses. I am God, you're not, and neither is your God. Again after time after time. God is patient with this proud man who says, no way, who essentially gives the middle finger to Yahweh. Oh, he didn't need to have 10 plagues, church. He could have ended Pharaoh like that. But to show his kindness, to show his love, his mercy, his patience, it's not why, but how. You say, I don't like that he removed the understanding, that he took the understanding from Esau, that prevented them from having any possible solution to the crisis that they're now dealing with. God is a very patient God, church. The Bible tells us that. He wants no man to perish. But his patience has a time limit. It has an expiration date. As I said last week, some people, they walk around, maybe some of you, and you think just because you haven't experienced consequences to certain things that you're getting away with things. And I say don't be fooled, because sometimes it takes weeks, months, years, decades before you actually begin to see the consequences for things that you think you're getting away with. And here for Esau, it's now 553 BC. And their people are being slaughtered. And there is no do-over. There is no reset. So many people think, well, I'll get right with God later on in my life. I don't need to worry about that now. And I'm saying there is coming a time that there is no other chance. There is no respawning, you might say, for your video game fans. That there isn't. And that is what's happening with Esau now. God has removed all possible understanding. Any possible wisdom to be able to deal with this crisis has been taken away. For them, their time limit's up, and God's judgment is going to be executed on them. He goes on in verse 9, and he says this, "And your mighty men shall be dismayed." They shall be dismayed, his mighty men, his most skillful warriors, his special forces, his SEAL Team 6. These guys, they're no-shows. They've been dismayed. They have been also shattered, terrified, dashed to pieces. They're not there. They're not available. O Teman, a reference to one of the most major populous cities in the northernmost district of Edom. And then he says, "So that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter." Every man. It is an emphasis in the original language of the thoroughness of God's judgment. These are horrific things. Remember, Obadiah's seeing all these things take place in a vision. They haven't yet happened. And it is gruesome. And so, this is what I see when I look at this text. I see Esau having a contingency plan in place for every possible outcome. They've got their allies. They've got their friends. They've got their wise man, their wisdom, their understanding. They have their geographical location. And it's all going to crumble. All the things that might have been able to help them have all now just fallen down upon them. And remember the people of Judah in the story. Judah. These people are decimated. These people are hopeless. These people have no national government. They have no military. They have no economy. They are disillusioned. They feel as if Yahweh has abdicated his throne, and why not? I mean, imagine if one day you go out here and there's just rubble. Okay? Because our country lays in ruins. You would feel pretty hopeless as well. Imagine if 9/11 didn't just happen in Manhattan, but it happened in every major city. Imagine if you were in Judah's shoes. That's what I want you to see. I want you to see that this is more than just words on a page, church. I want you to feel like they would have felt. They feel disillusioned. They feel hopeless. Maybe some of you feel that way right now. You feel like you pray all the time, and it seems as if God doesn't answer. He doesn't even hear you. But newsflash, Judah. God hasn't left you. God hasn't abdicated his throne. The very fact that this is happening to the house of Esau is evidence that your God reigns. And the same God that brought this judgment on Esau is evidence that he still is king, that he's still calling the shots